just letting you know. So this Sunday is the Feast of the Good Shepherd. As you saw, the shepherd theme was resonant throughout the readings today. But there was actually another theme that also caught my eye, and I included here a quote of different scriptures from each of our readings that stood out to me. It's really small. I'll read it to you. From the psalm that we heard today, there was that line, "You spread a table before me in the presence of those who trouble me. You have anointed my head with oil, and my cup is running over." This line of that very familiar psalm always grabs me, this image of this feast before, some translations say, before my enemies, in the presence of my enemies, in the presence of those who trouble me. And then this image of the oil is such an image of abundance, the cup running over. And that got me thinking about the notion of abundance. And I saw this theme in all of the readings. In the letter of Acts that we heard from, all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. It was really this trust that there was enough for everyone. And I have heard that the world's problems aren't a matter of scarcity, it's a matter of distribution. And the early disciples took faith in that and acted in this trust that there was in the abundance of what all had enough for each as any had need. And this notion of abundance continued as I read through the lectionary. But there was also this other line in the First Peter that stood out to me, and I have it quoted there. When he was abused, speaking of Jesus, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to one who judges justly. That line is not about abundance, but it struck me as compelling. And I'm going to bring it all together at one point, but I want to just put that out there. I'm highlighting these verses, if you could say. And then obviously in the strand of abundance we have from the gospel, I have come that they may have life and have it in abundance. Theologians talk about a theology of abundance versus a theology of scarcity. Is one operating from trust that there is enough for all, and from that living in a state of generosity and of communal, kind of as we see in that book of Acts, communal supporting one another? Or are we operating from a place, and this isn't necessarily individual scarcity, because there are individuals with scarcity, but it's a cosmic perspective. Is there enough for everyone? And this really does beg the question, because there is inequality that we see around us. There are those who take more than their share. And this juxtaposition of abundance and our enemies, or those who trouble us, in the psalm is really where I want to hone in. Because as I was kind of chewing through these readings and wrestling with them, entertaining this abundance, thinking of those who take more than their share, thinking of those who feel scarcity while there is enough in the world if it were divided. The psalm gives us an interesting coming together of all these questions for me. It makes me think of Jesus's teachings to love our enemies. It makes me think of the bless those who persecute you that comes up in the Beatitudes. And while I was kind of wrestling with this line of the psalm, I remembered something I want to share with you all. And it's a story I wrote when I was in seminary. and it's entitled The First Love Feast, and it's illustrated with watercolors that I did. This was for my Old Testament class. And I think this story of the first love feast pulls together all of these threads that I have kind of put out there as a jumble so far. This question of abundance, this question of those who take more than their share, the question of loving our enemies. What does that mean in the midst of all of this? I want to share with you the intro first to this story. It's really small there, but I have the real text here. And it has a quote from the Proverbs. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat, and if they are thirsty, give them water to drink. For you will heap coals of fire on their heads, and the Lord will reward you. Nestled among many proverbs which often seem to be reiterating spiritual common sense, we find this shocking proverb directing us to feed our enemies and to give them drink if they are thirsty. Supposedly by doing this, we are heaping coals of fire on their heads. At first glance, these coals of fire sound violent and stand in stark contrast with the seemingly pacifistic idea of feeding one's enemies. This is most likely due to the fact that we are detached from the historical context from which these proverbs were written. Some assert that during the time these proverbs were written, it was not an uncommon practice to have penitents carry a tray of hot coals, and some theologians believe this to be the source of the metaphor in the Proverbs. Essentially, by feeding one's enemies, you will trigger a sense of remorse within them, with the aim of changing their hearts, and it is this that is pleasing to God. It is also maintained that at the time, the only way of starting fires, since there were no matches or lighters, was either by striking flint on stone or rubbing two sticks together to create a spark. Since this was very time-consuming, a village fire tender would have been appointed. He maintained a fire, and during morning time, he would bring coals to different houses in the villages, balancing the tray of coals upon a wooden block on his head. As one source cites, the familiar sight of the fire tender making his rounds with the coals heaped on his head gave rise to a common turn of phrase, that if you give kindness or do good to an evil man, you will turn him into one who spreads the warmth of love wherever he goes. You will heap coals of fire on his head. Regardless of which interpretation is most accurate, the message is still the same. The proverb turns upside down basic assumptions of the time about how to confront one's enemies. The narrator elevates a response of hospitality and kindness instead of violence. It is not surprising then that Paul quotes this proverb speaking within the context of overcoming evil with good. Too often, this proverb is watered down and people assert, all right, we should feed our personal enemies, those people in our lives we don't get along with, but national affairs are different. This narrative, taken from 2 Kings 6, 8 through 23, however, reveals the all-encompassing scope of the simple command to feed our enemies. With no further ado, I present to you the first love feast, illustrated by Justin Cannon. A long time ago in the land of the east, there lived a king named Aram, who was the leader of a great army. He was at war with the king of the Holy Land. One night, while he and his army were traveling, he called his officers and told them where they would camp for the night. What he did not know is that the king of the Holy Land had a friend named Elisha who would often talk to God. That night, God told Elisha where the enemy's army was going to camp, and Elisha went and told this to the king of the Holy Land. Because of Elisha, the king was always prepared and knew where Aram and his army were camping. King Aram noticed this and called all his officers together. He did not know about Elisha, and so he asked his officers, "Tell me which one of you is a spy." Who has been telling the king of the Holy Land where we will camp each night? And one of the officers said to King Aram, none of us, my king. It is the holy man Elisha who tells the king of the Holy Land. And King Aram replied, go and find where this man Elisha is. We must capture him. He sent his men out on horses and chariots, and they surrounded the city where Elisha was staying. Early in the morning, Elisha's friend Esau woke up, went outside, and saw the men on horses and chariots surrounding the city. And he ran back inside, yelling, Elisha, the city is surrounded. What should we do? Stepping outside, should say Elisha, responded, do not be afraid. There are more with us than there are with them. Esau did not know that what Elisha meant because King Aram's army was large in number. Then Elisha prayed, open my friend's eyes that he may see what I mean. And suddenly Esau saw the mountains were full of horses and chariots of fire with shining angels on them. Suddenly the army came running down toward them. Elisha prayed to God to blind the army, and suddenly the army stopped. They could not see, and they all felt around with their arms confused. Elisha had a plan in mind, so he went to the army and said, this is not the way. Since you cannot see, I will lead you to the man you seek. Elisha knew they were after him, but they could not see it was Elisha, so they followed him. Elisha led them into a nearby city, and when they got there, Elisha prayed to God, open their eyes so that they can see. Suddenly they could see again, and they saw that they were not in the city where Elisha lived, and they no longer had their weapons. When the king of the Holy Land saw them, he rushed over to Elisha and said, Father, should I kill them? Should I kill them? And Elisha responded, did you capture these men? No, it was by the power of God that they were brought here. Elisha then remembered the proverb, your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat, and if they are thirsty, water to drink. So he said to the king, set food and water before them, so they may eat and drink. Then let them go back to their king. So the king of the Holy Land did exactly that. He prepared for them a great feast, and they ate and drank until they were no longer hungry or thirsty. Afterwards, he sent them on their way. They went back to King Aram and told him all that had happened. And King Aram and his army never attacked the Holy Land again. I share this story with you because this to me is an unpacking and a glimpse of what that means, spreading your table before me in the presence of those who trouble me. And it brings that together with that proverb, if your enemy is hungry, to feed him. And it brings it together with the question of abundance and who is provided for. And it connects it to Jesus saying, love your enemies, bless those who persecute you. And it really is a great glimpse of what it means to engage conflict nonviolently, creatively. And I think as we continue to wrestle through conflict on a global level, on a national level, on communal levels, individual levels, we need stories like this that give us a glimpse of another way. In closing, I want to share with you an excerpt from a sermon the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave at a Baptist church in 1956. His sermon was entitled, The Most Durable Power. Always be sure that you struggle with Christian methods and Christian weapons. Never succumb to the temptation of becoming bitter. As you press on for justice, be sure to move with dignity and discipline, using only the weapon of love. Let no man pull you so low as to hate him. Always avoid violence. If you succumb to the temptation of using violence in your struggle, unborn generations will be the recipients of a long and desolate night of bitterness, and your chief legacy to the future will be an endless reign of meaningless chaos. In your struggle for justice, let your oppressor know that you are not attempting to defeat or humiliate him, or even to pay him back for injustices that he has heaped upon you. Let him know that you are merely seeking justice for him as well as yourself. I still believe that standing up for the truth of God is the greatest thing in the world. This is the end of life. The end of life is not to be happy. The end of life is not to achieve pleasure and avoid pain. The end of life is to do the will of God, come what may. I still believe that love is the most durable power in the world. Over the centuries, men have sought to discover the highest good. This has been the chief quest of ethical philosophy. This was one of the big questions of Greek philosophy. The Epicureans and the Stoics sought to answer it. Plato and Aristotle sought to answer it. What is the summum bonum of life? I think I have discovered the highest good. It is love. This principle stands at the center of the cosmos. As John says, God is love. He who loves is a participant in the being of God. He who hates does not know God. My prayer for us in moving forward and navigating the conflicts of our lives and seeking justice in being participants in the being of God is that we may take that story from 2 Kings to heart, take the creativity of this nonviolent approach to heart, and harness that weapon of love that embraces even our enemies. May we follow our Good Shepherd in that way of peace.